Well, hi, I'm glad you're here today. We're going to talk about a very important subject, and that's God's infinite nature. So our goal today is to understand God's infinite nature, how it answers most atheistic questions about his existence. So it's very important that we understand this. And so in all of these lectures, there are going to be things in what I say that are not in the PowerPoint. And you're going to have to watch these lectures in order to make sure you get everything. All right, so let's start with this. So there are thousands of different gods in the world. What makes the Christian gods different from those gods? That's a reasonable question, and a question that could be asked in lots of different places. But here in the subcontinent, yeah, you could definitely ask that question. I mean, India's got lots of religions, and what makes the Christian God different from those other gods in the universe, or not universe, but in the world that are worshipped? And like what makes the Christian God different. So I want to also add another part to this. It's a part that you wouldn't normally think about, but it's really important. When we talk about God, and when someone says, I don't believe in God, the question has to be, what do you mean by God? You have to define God. You can't just say, I don't believe in God, because a Hindu says, well, I don't believe in God. Do they mean the all-pervading reality, the ground of existence? What do they mean by God? And if you have different understanding of what God is, it's going to dramatically change what you believe. So for Christians and Jews as well, Christians have a very specific understanding of what they mean by the name God. And it's important to understand that this description that I'm giving you of God didn't just jump up because atheists have been asking these questions for the last 200 years. No, no, no. This description of God has been around from the very beginning of when we actually read letters and articles and comments by Christians from the time of the earliest church. So here's the main thing. God exists in his own dimension of being, which no human can detect or understand. His own dimension of being. Now that's very philosophical, but it's actually biblical as well. And it's really important that you get this. We live in our dimension of being, and if any, we live in our own dimension of being, and because we live in our own dimension of being, it's everything we understand, and we don't understand much. It's limited to this dimension of being. But God exists in his own dimension of being. In his own dimension of being, you can't take the laws of physics in this dimension and apply it to his dimension. And people say, well, how can you have 3 and 1? Well, one answer to that is you're thinking in our dimension. In our dimension, there's certain rules of mathematics, but the rules of mathematics don't apply in every dimension the same way. The rules of physics are completely different in God's dimension of being. And if you try to use physics to understand the God of the Bible, well, then guess what? You're not going to understand him. You're going to create a false God. You create a false God by saying, well, the God of the Bible that I believe in is the God who fits into my physics definition of what God should be like. Well, whatever, that doesn't help. So what makes the Christian God different? Okay, this God, okay, it's really important. He is without any limitations and therefore is eternal, without beginning or end, and is infinite in all his being. Now, he has no limits. And that wouldn't necessarily have to be, because you could be in a dimension and have limits. I mean, I have limits, you have limits, we all have limits. Our limits are pretty earth-shattering limits. I mean, there's just very little we can do. We're so limited. But God has 0 limits. There's nothing that stops God from doing anything. And when you have someone who has no limits, you call that person infinite. And he's the only infinite being in all existence, any dimension. He is infinite. Infinite, the word in means without. Our word impossible, you have the word possible, and you put the word im on it, it becomes impossible. That's the way infinite works too. Finite means having limits. So something is finite, it means it's limited. So God is infinite. He is without limits. He is in, means not, finite, limits. We get our word finish from there, okay? He's infinite. And so that means space can't contain him. And this is really important. We talk about the fact that God is everywhere in all of his being at the same time. And that's impossible in our dimension, but not for God. Because God's relationship to our dimension is different than our relationship to our dimension. We're limited by space. God is not limited by space. So God, in all of his being, can be every single tiny millimeter of the universe. God is there in all of his being. So God speaking to Moses, and God speaking to Pharaoh, and God speaking to somebody else all at the same time. And that's not a problem for God because he is without limits. Space doesn't limit him. Space limits me. I can only be in one place at one time, and hardly there. Time cannot limit God. Now, this is one that we don't believe. We say it, but we don't believe it. But we have to understand that time is created. It's created. As Einstein says, it's a part of space. I mean, it's just created. It's another dimension. And God is not limited by time. I don't want to say God's without time. I don't want to say God is with time. I don't want to say God is outside of time. I don't want to say that God is inside of time. I don't want to say any of those things because God's relationship to time is completely different than the word in, out, with, without. I mean, it's completely different from those. You can't use those words to describe God's relationship to time. They don't work. So that means physics can't limit him. So, you know, the idea of miracles, well, physics is not, it's not even an issue for God because God is not limited by space and time. God's not limited by anything. He can do whatever he wants to do. Now, that also means that God has no beginning. Because if God is without limitations, he's without the limitation of beginning. The word finite often has the idea of something that has a beginning. The universe is finite, it has a beginning. God is infinite, he has no beginning. Now, you say, but what existed before God? Well, you got to understand there was no before God created time. Before is something that happens with time, but God created time. And there is no before, there's no after, there's no during in God's infinite existence. He has no beginning. He has no ending. He exists in his own dimension of being. And he depends on nothing, ever, 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 ever. Now, he can use things. He can choose not to do something himself and use a means to do it. So he can use Jeremiah, the prophet, to go to the people and preach to them. He can use Peter to preach to people. He can even use people to do his miracles. But he doesn't depend on those people. He is freely using them, not because he needs them, but because he loves them. He exists in and of himself. He's not dependent upon anything else for his existence. Remember, he lives in his own dimension. He owns his own dimension. He is his own dimension. And he exists in and of himself. And you can't use any of our understanding of existence, and it doesn't work with God. There's no beginning and no end. So who created God? Oh, that doesn't even understand at all. Who created God? No, you don't understand. He dwells in his own dimension of existence. Without time, space, and all of that stuff, all of those things are created by God for this dimension of existence. He exists in and of himself. In other words, he is who he is. There you go, that works. He never learns because he already knows. It never learns. It never learns anything. There's no new information for God. Because learning implies, really seriously, learning implies that um, there's that somehow God is finite. Learning implies that there are things that God is not aware of, but he is not limited by time or by space. So the future, he is not limited. The past, he's not limited by anything. His existence is not limitable. And he never changes. He says this a lot. He never changes. And it's it's because of the fact that change is involving with time, with the before and after, and God's relationship to time is impossible for us to figure out. You can't figure out God's relationship to time. You're not going to do it. You can't, I mean, I can't figure out a Pakistani's relationship to time, but that's different. You cannot figure out God's relationship to time. It won't work because God's relationship to time, he's not in time, he's not outside of time, he's not with time, he's not under time, he's not over time. And none of those things work. All of those words are limiting words, and God is unlimited, but he never changes. God's personal name is Yahweh, which means he is. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. I am who I am. Go, what does that mean? Exactly. Remember what we said? God exists in and of himself. He's dependent upon nobody. I am who I am because he exists in and of himself. If we say that God's all powerful, we mean that God has no limitations. He can do anything he wants to do. He's not limited by the laws of physics. He's not limited by human abilities to conceive, to understand, explain what he's doing or what he's able to do. If God were limited in a way humans are limited, he wouldn't be God. I mean, if you start limiting God in anything, he's no longer God. So what makes the Christian God different? Well, what we just said makes him completely different from every other God except for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Every other God. This concept of God being completely himself, completely belonging to his own dimension of existence. Yet God is able to come in, not come in exactly, he's able to work in our dimension of existence without any problem at all. He created our dimension of existence. He's able to work in time without any problem at all. He's able to work in the future, past, and present all at the same, what we call moment, but not for him. Why? Because God is not limited. But having said that, he also has a character, and his character is amazing. He is completely good, perfectly loving, and he's personal. And that is not what we'd expect. He's gracious. He is love. God is love. God is good. God is truth. God is joy. And honestly, we would never, never, never think that the God who is this kind of God, whose relationship to time and space is completely incomprehensible. You can never understand God's relationship to time and space because God dwells on his own dimension. He's unlimited. But even though that's true, he's gracious, he brings joy, he's love, he's good, he's truth. How's that even possible? What makes him different? Christians believe that God created all that exists, including time, space, natural laws, all physical and spiritual reality. You got to get this into your mind. Everything that exists, God made it. And he made it simply by choosing to make it. There's no exertion of power. It's not like God would, he doesn't do that stuff. He doesn't need to do that stuff. He says, and God said, let there be light. There's light plus. See, God doesn't need to push. Doesn't need to. He's God. He speaks the word and it happens. Plus. That's all. The Christians believe that God holds together all reality in our universe by his own will and power. We believe that. We believe that God's just holding everything together by his own will and power. If God says, I'm tired of this universe I created with these humans, I'm just tired of it. Universe, done. Everything just stops existing. Bus. See, God can do that because God holds everything together. All right. So the reason this is important is because if an atheist says to you, I don't believe in God, you go, well, which God are you talking about? If they just say, I don't believe in God, that Hindu God? I mean, we need more specific understanding. The reason we need that is because the answer that you give to them about why you believe in God is really focused by what God we're talking about. So you need to know what God is like. God is without limits. He is perfectly good, perfectly loving, perfectly truthful. And he created everything that exists. He lives in his own dimension. And it can't be measured and it can't be seen. So those are the basic things you need to make sure you understand about what the Christian God is like. Unlimited, in his own dimension of existence. Good, perfectly loving, perfectly truthful, perfectly joyful. Created all things that exist, including time, space, natural laws, and all physical and spiritual reality. He holds everything together by his own will and power. So when we say, what makes the Christian God different? That's what makes the Christian God different. God bless y'all. Have a great day.